After years of indolence, sleeping on soft, well-plumped beds, sitting upon padded cushions on golden ornate thrones encrusted with rubies and diamonds and emeralds and pearls, the prince, who was not a bad man at all, but the prince had grown flabby. Flabby in body, flabby in mind. He was by nature a people pleaser. He wanted to be liked. He wanted to be liked by his populace, even though he seldom saw much more of them than driving past in the carriage doing this. But nevertheless, he wanted to feel that they supported him and they cheered out of a genuine sense of his popularity and not because the guards had threatened to behead them if they didn't. He wanted to be liked by his courtiers, his viziers, his advisors, which is seldom easy because usually they vie with each other to see whose advice will be taken. And as much as you might want to please everyone, you can't take everyone's advice when it contradicts. And so the prince had upset a few people by not following their advice and pleased others by following their advice. And it wasn't necessarily that the advice he followed was the best, the wisest, the most sensible advice, merely that the people presenting it perhaps had the most forceful personalities, and the prince was, if nothing else, eminently bullyable. It had reached that time in the prince's reign when he had wined and dined no end of princesses from neighbouring regions and duchesses and countesses and eldest daughters of princes and what have you. But nothing had come of any of it. And for once his viziers and courtiers agreed with each other instead of contesting with one another, that it really was getting to the sort of time when he ought to consider marrying and creating an heir for the kingdom. But the trouble was, the prince didn't really want to marry any of them. They were nice women that were brought to him. Some of them were intelligent, and some of them, frankly, had the personality of a tin of beige paint. Some made him laugh, and some bored him to tears. There was a mixture of all sorts of people brought before him, but there was never that spark where he could feel that he wanted to spend the rest of his life looking at this face or that face across the breakfast table. And of course, being a prince, it never occurred to him that all of these lovely young aristocrats and royal ladies might not much want to look at him for the rest of their lives across the breakfast table. But he thought of the world through his own lens, as many people do. The prince was not a cruel man, not a bloodthirsty man, but it was expected of a prince that a prince should go hunting, should ride to horses with the hounds, hunt foxes, hunt deer, hunt wild boar, do all the usual things that princes and aristocrats the world over and royalty are expected to do. And so come the day, a lovely summer's day, rich and warm, and the royal gardens filled with the aroma of roses and heavily scented flowers. A wonderful day for just mooching about, sitting in hammocks, watching the world go past. But one of the local dukes wanted to go hunting and had organised a hunting party, and an invite had been sent to the prince. And he liked to please people, as much as he would have preferred just a lounge in a hammock watching the butterflies and the bees. Duty called. And so off he went on the Duke's hunt. He mounted his horse, he joined with all of the others, all of them a few sheets to the wind by this point, of course, because they'd all had that little bit of Dutch courage to get their spirits up. And off they rode into the woods, chasing after wild boar on this particular occasion. Horns were blown, dogs were barking, they followed them this way and that. Some men thought the boar had gone over there, some of the royal ladies thought the boar had gone over there. They all went in their separate directions, the prince included, going off in the direction he thought the boar was snuffling and the dogs were barking. Deeper and deeper into the woods they went, until the prince realised that not only had he lost track of all of the other members of the hunting party, servants included, but he had no idea where he was. Well, the royal forest, but which way was the castle? Which way was the duke's abode? Which way were the other men and women and the servants of the hunting party? Were they left or right? Were they east or west or north or south? For all he knew, they could have been up or down. And after a lot of meandering and calling and shouting until his voice was beginning to get hoarse, he realised it was getting a little darker and a little darker. It was summer. It wasn't going to get pitch black, but the evening was drawing on and his stomach was beginning to rumble. He had never been this long without food before. He began to get a little worried. And the horse that he was riding on was looking tired and thirsty and as if it had seen better days. When they came in the midst of this forest to a stream, a small gentle stream going through the forest, not a raging river or anything of that sort, a small and gentle stream, and the prince dismounted from the poor old horse and led it down to water and let it have a good long drink from the stream. And, as I say, the day was pulling on. He was beginning to feel hungry. He was feeling thirsty himself. He didn't really fancy drinking from a stream. He'd never drunk from a stream in his life. Not even as a child had he drunk from a stream. He had a little wine left in the flagon at his hip, but that wouldn't last an awful lot longer. And the trouble with wine is you may drink it, but it doesn't really quench thirst. And so he began to get a little anxious, a little fretful. And he thought he would sit beneath a tree in the shade and just rest for a little while and see if he could think of what to do. He could perhaps be inspired with a plan as to what the most sensible step to take next would be. And he sat, and he sat, and he sat, and he ended up doing what he had actually initially planned to do that morning at breakfast, which was watch the patterns of the bees and the butterflies flittering past. Except these were not in his royal gardens, but in the depth of the royal woods. And the poor old horse, having taken its fill of the river, it lay down and had itself a rest. Maybe it was the anxiety, maybe it was the warmth of the day, maybe it was the somnolent drone of the bees, but the prince gradually fell asleep. And when, some hours later, he startled to awake, the first thing he saw was not a horse, but it was something hairy and something hoofed, looking at him, watching him. The prince startled back against the tree underneath which he was sleeping. "Who are you?" he said at first, and then almost immediately, What are you?" For as he took this personage in, he saw at first perhaps the most handsome man he had ever seen in his life. But then he noticed that this handsome man was not dressed in the fine raiments of a prince or a duke or an earl or a king, but in a sort of strange rustic green jerkin type arrangement, open down to the chest, and a hairy chest, the well-muscled chest of someone who works the land, who works with their hands rather than sits on silk cushions all day long. And then he noticed that from that handsome forehead there came two curving horns back across the top of his head and down at the side and curling the horns of perhaps a goat or a ram. Not that the prince was particularly familiar with goats or rams, except to see them from a great distance. And as if that were not peculiar enough, when he pulled himself back a little further and he looked down, the man was wearing what at first the prince assumed were some sort of animal skin trousers, for they were furry and shaggy, and it was only when this strange and curious figure moved from a crouching position in front of the prince and stood a full majestic height that the prince could see these were not trousers, that this man, this creature's legs really were that hairy and curved in a strange and peculiar fashion and ending in hooves. The figure smiled, laughed, threw back his head and laughed a deep and throaty laugh, and, well, the prince caught an eyeful of a great deal more, bearing in mind that this figure was not wearing trousers at all. And well, the prince didn't know where to look. It was difficult to look anywhere else, but the prince did not know where to look. And his heart was going 9 to the dozen, because he had never seen such a beast in his life. A thing that was half human and half goat, half animal, half thing of the wild, of the woods. And again he started, well, what are you? What manner of creature are you? Are you a demon? Are you a fiend, a devil of the woods? What are you? And the creature, the man, the being, whatever you want to call it, said, I mean you no harm. Are you from hell? Asked the prince. I know of no hell. I am from the forest. Well, I am the prince of this land, said the prince, as if he could be anything else, dripping in rubies and diamonds and such fine and elaborate clothing. And I, said the man, am lord, you may call me, of this forest. This is my land. I think you'll find it's my land, said the prince, rather forgetting that he was facing a creature not human. And those deep green eyes stared into his, and he said, this land belongs to no one. Not even me. I belong to the land. You too, prince, belong to the land. And you could belong to me. And with that, the satyr, the faun, the whatever it might be, this creature of the woods, leaned in and kissed the prince full upon the lips. And the prince startled back, shocked, and not a little pleasantly surprised. For whilst the creature smelt deeply of the mulch of the woods, smelt as if, well, he slept in the woods, there was a deeper taste upon the lips of the man, something honeyed as if he had been drinking mead, and a very fine mead, not long beforehand. And, well, one thing to another led. It was not until the morning when the prince awoke to find most of his clothes scattered hither and yon around the glade, and the man, goat, satyr, faun, whatever he might be, quite gone, quite disappeared, and his horse disappeared, that he lay there at first wondering if he had had the most peculiar dream. And then as he stood and realised the state of undress, he noticed not only that his clothes were hither and yon, but that there were scratches upon arms and chest, scratches from fingernails, and what felt like a bruise or a bite, a love bite perhaps, upon his neck. And then, down by the stream, he noticed hoof marks, not from a horse's hoof, but from something more satyr-sized, and he realised that this was no dream. And he sat heavily into the mud on the banks of the river for, well, quite some time, his mind reeling by all that had happened, things that he had never expected to happen. Well, you wouldn't, would you, with a goat creature in the woods, and not knowing what to do, and realising he had been out away from the castle all night. There must surely be search parties hunting the woods for him, looking high and low for him. But they hadn't found him. He hadn't heard anyone calling in the woods, Your Highness, where are you? He hadn't heard the sounds of trumpets being blown to attract attention. All he had known in the night was, well, the satyr. And he pulled on his clothes, best he could, for he'd never once dressed himself in his life. There were always valets to do that for him, but he did his best. And realising that the horse had up and away taken itself off somewhere, that however he was to get home it would be, well, Shanks's pony rather than horseback, he wondered which way to go. He could see no signs of the horse's hoof prints to know whether it had gone left or right, north or south, east or west. Only the goat hoof prints. And knowing not what else to do, and somehow it did seem a preferable thing to do, he followed the prints made by the goat, or whatever it was. Deeper and deeper and deeper into the already deep woods he went, recognising nothing. He knew little of trees to know one from another. Certainly this was no part of the woods he had seen before on previous hunting expeditions. But he followed and he followed and he followed, mile after mile after mile. His stomach rumbling with emptiness. He saw berries and nuts and such like upon trees and bushes, but he was hesitant to eat them, for he had been told by his nanny as a child that many berries that grow in the woods and in the gardens can be poisonous and dangerous, and he should only ever eat what was brought to him by the servants from the kitchen. And he passed up the chance to eat them, whether wisely or unwisely. On and on he went, feet sore, stomach rumbling, mind reeling. And at length the day grew long and long, and he grew tighter and tighter, for he was not a fit man, as I say. He was flabby from years of indolence. And he took his rest beneath a tree, wondering what on earth he should do, when he heard a rustle in the bushes, and there once again was the goat man, the satyr, the faun. This time bearing fruit, apples and pears and things plucked from trees. And the two sat opposite one another and shared the meal. The prince hungrily, greedily, the satyr leisurely. And when the food was finished, well, one thing led to yet another, and the conversations the prince had been preparing to have at the very first sight of the satyr. Where was he? How could he get back to the castle? Which direction should he go in? Where would he be safe? What could he eat? What should he do? All of those conversations were, well, forgotten in the moment. And when all was done and all was dusted, the prince fell asleep, his head resting upon the satyr's hairy chest. And when he awoke, it was dawn again. The birds were singing, and there was a freshness in the air, and the horned creature was once again gone. Again the prince followed the footsteps, and again this day repeated the previous. For mile upon mile upon mile he walked, with no sign of, well, not simply castles and palaces, but no sign of even a woodsman's hut, even some passing peasant he could have asked directions of. No sign of anything but trees and the occasional noise of a bird or the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of what might have been a badger or a wild boar or practically any damn thing in the undergrowth, until at length, tired and exhausted, he sat down again, and again the satyr appeared, and again food was presented, and again distractions were presented, until at the following morning, still without any conversations being had, the prince continued on his bleary journey, wondering how on earth he could walk for so many days without sight of something. I mean, he knew the royal forests were big, but they couldn't possibly be this big, he thought to himself. And the forest, he noticed, was getting sparser and sparser, the trees fewer and fewer, the gaps between them bigger and bigger. And the trees he did see were not as grand and impressive as the trees he had passed earlier. They were becoming smaller, and the ground was taking an upward gradient, upward and ever upward. And there were no mountains, or even significantly large hills in the prince's kingdom. It was a place of rolling downs and small woodlands. Where on earth could he be, he wondered to himself, but on he went. And the weather was becoming significantly less summery, a little chillier and a little chillier and a little chillier as hour led to hour led to hour. By the end of the day, not only was he feeling the grime and the stiffness of the clothes, and the smell of them, they were unwashed. He had never worn unwashed clothes before. And his feet were aching and his stomach was empty, and he was becoming more than a little frightened. And when at length he decided he was so tired now he wanted to sit, and this time, he would insist upon conversation with the creature when it appeared, would get answers to his questions. He sat beneath the tree and waited and waited and waited. And the satyr, the fawn, the whatever it was, did not appear. Even as the evening drew on and became darker and darker, when the prince finally fell asleep, he fell asleep alone. And he awoke alone. Awoke shivering, for it was now noticeably chillier, and the leaves were beginning to fall from the tree, which they should not have done for several months. On and on, up and up he went, and it was now no longer just a gradient, just a slope upwards, just a gentle hill pushing up and up. It was now getting significantly mountainous, and the prince could see, as the trees got thinner and thinner, big, huge boulders in front of him. And turn as he may, he couldn't retrace his steps. He wasn't sure which way to come. He was maybe lightheaded from lack of food, lack of water, from tiredness and exertion. He'd never made this much physical effort in his entire life. He really didn't know where he was or what he was doing, which way was which. He tried to remember things told him by groundskeepers and so on about the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, but when he looked up, well, there was no longer the tree cover as an excuse, but the sky was grey and overcast and cloudy, and it was difficult to see the sun at all clearly, to know even whether it was rising from east or overhead or going down into the west, or what it was doing. Up and up he went, climbing and clambering, tearing clothes upon thorny bushes, until by the end of that day, famished and exhausted and tired, his clothes were in ribbons, and he found a mountain stream to quench his thirst, and he drank from the stream, lapping it up, handfuls of water, almost like a wild animal. And he felt like a wild animal. He had the beginnings of a beard, which he had never had in his entire life. He'd always been shaved and polished to within an inch of his life. And he felt his hair, I mean, there were leaves and twigs and Lord knows what else, and he felt he must look like some crazed wild man of the woods. And his trousers were getting loose. The belt, which had been straining at his paunch a few days ago, was, well, he was having to hitch his drawers up to keep them on properly and putting the belt in a couple of notches. That evening, when he saw a bush with a few berries and fruit of some description, he didn't know what type of fruit it was, nothing he recognised. But whatever warnings his nanny had given him in childhood went out the window. His hunger was so sufficient, he ate what he found and liked it. And again he slept alone that night. And again the next day he awoke alone and journeyed on up and up, getting colder and colder, pulling what little material remained of his jacket and his shirt about him, until he realised he was now really quite high up in the mountains which should not exist, for there were no mountains in his land. And he could see far into the distance, he could see forests rolling hither and yon, but what he couldn't see were villages, or castles, or roads, or any sign of human habitation whatsoever. And he thought he would like to die up here. What choice would he have but to die up here? He was getting thinner and thinner, shivering and shaking and rattling like some old woman in the depths of winter. He had no idea where he was. Well, wherever his palace was, it certainly wasn't going up, but up he continued. He had no idea why he was going up. He should turn back, but where would he turn back to? He could, from this distance, he could see there was nothing to turn back towards. Would he be eaten by bears? Would he be eaten by wolves? He didn't know what would happen to him. And then the snow began to fall and fall and fall, and on he trudged, trying to ignore it, trying to imagine burning log fires in the great palace hall, trying to imagine mulled wine, trying to imagine roast haunches of meat and all the things that would cheer him up on a winter's day, as he went on and on and on and on, until at length, and he didn't know whether it was the same day or the next, because he was in such a strange state of mind by then, almost a fugue. He had no idea one day from another. He saw up ahead a cave, and he came to the cave. If there were bears inside and they ate him, well, at least it would be over, he thought to himself. And if there were no bears, then at least he could get out of this damned snow. Into the cave he went, and up at the far end of the cave he could see a flicker of light. Now, of course, bears do not light campfires, so this must be someone, a human, someone he could turn to, even if it was the goat creature with a fire, something. Off to the light he went, calling ahead, asking for help, and receiving no response until he was close to the fire itself and holding his shivering, thin hand, so thin that the rings which once strained at his fingers were now loose and like to drop off at any minute. And it was then he realised that he was not alone. There was somebody else sitting on the other side of the campfire, a figure in a long cloak with a hood pulled up. And he stepped back a little and said, "I am the prince of this land. I have been lost for days and days and days. Do you mind if I sit and warm myself by your fire?" And the woman, for it was a woman, spoke and said, "Be warm, my child, be warm." And he said, "Well, do you live here? Do you live up these mountains? I never even knew there were mountains in my kingdom. In fact, I was absolutely positive there were not." "Aha," came the voice from within the shadow of the hood. "You are no longer in your kingdom. You are in my kingdom now." The prince sat back and surprised as he had been not so long ago in the kingdom of the goat man, to now be in the kingdom of this strange woman. And then a thought struck him. Am I dead? Is this the afterlife? Am I in some world beyond worlds? "You are wise, my son," said the old woman, and she pulled her hood back, and he could see that she was infinitely old, older than his mother, older than his grandmother, wrinkled beyond measure, with long white hair streaming down. But you are not dead. You are in the world beyond the world, and have been for some time, my son. When you first left your palace, you were soft and indolent. You were lazy. And now, look at you. And he looked down at himself, and it was as if he could see himself in a mirror, although there was no mirror there to look into. You are lean and rangy and wild like a wolf, the old woman said to him. Determined and hungry like a wolf. You are not some soft and pliable, bullyable thing anymore. You are now a better prince than you ever would have been. More than that, said the old woman, you now know what the fruits of the forest taste like. You know the pleasures there are to be had in the world, and the terms you must have them upon. Rest a while, and think of the kingdom you return to, that you must lead and not be led by. And she handed him a cup of something warm and wonderful, and he drank deeply of it and fell asleep. And when he awoke, the fire was ash, and the old woman nowhere to be seen. And when he emerged out of the darkness of the cave, he could see far down into the forests, and there, far off, many, many, many miles away, was, well, a haze with the tiniest wisp of smoke. And although he could see no castle, he could see no town around it, he knew that was where he must go. He knew that was his world on the other side of this world. And as if he was no longer hungry and half-starved, but filled with energy, perhaps from the drink, perhaps from the sleep, perhaps from something else entirely, he ran, stumbled, galloped down the hillside as fast as he could. Down that mountain, down and down and down, until he came to the forest's edge, and he continued on at a decent trot through the woods, intuiting his way back, knowing whether to turn left or right, east or south, north or west, following a path that only he could sense through the forest, like a wolf following a scent. On and on and on he went, until at length it began to grow dark, but also warm. For with every mile he took away from the mountain, it grew a little warmer and a little warmer and a little warmer. Until at length he came to a stream, not after many days' journey, but just after the one. And the stream seemed awfully familiar. And there the hoof prints in the mud. And there his own boot prints on the other side of the stream. And he paused a while and sat a while to regain his breath. And when he looked up, there was the satyr, the fawn, bearing fruit. And they sat and they ate. And one thing did lead to another, but before the prince fell asleep, he spoke to the satyr, and the satyr spoke to him. Will you come with me to my kingdom? Come back with me. We can find long robes for you to wear so that people will not see your hooves and your shaggy legs. Come back with me. Be as my companion in the palace. I want to be with you in a way I never wanted to be with any of those princesses and countesses and duchesses. And the goat man, the satyr, the fawn, said, you are a prince in the castle. I am a lord in the woods. I no more want to dwell in your palace than you would take pleasure sleeping all night, every night in these woods. But, said the satyr, whenever you wish it, come down to the stream's edge, and I will find you. And then you may go back to your palace when you please. And I will go back to my woods when I please. I in my world, you in yours. You in your silks and raiments, and me in fur and wildness. And then the prince fell asleep. And when he awoke alone the next morning, within an hour he had found his way back to the palace, where everyone was tearing their hair out with worry, convinced he had been eaten by bears or wild boars or some damn thing or another. And they looked him up and down, grubby and ragged and much thinner and rangier than ever he was before, and as much as the fine silk sat upon his well-scrubbed body when it was well scrubbed, he kept the beard to remind himself that he was not a pampered poodle upon a silk cushion to be led on a lead by viziers and courtiers and advisers, but a wolf of the woods, long and lean and rangy, who made the decisions and led the people of the court and the people of his land in wise and fierce and bold ways. And whenever the call of the wild came, to the woods he would go, and none of the courtiers ever knew quite where he went in the woods, but he would always return within a day or two, or sometimes 3, with a smile upon his face and a fire within his heart.